Well, now we are officially beginning. So welcome to Creative Coding for Designers during San Diego Design Week. It's a pleasure to see so many, I guess, screens, not so many faces. Thank you for those of you showing your faces or having avatars. And hey, Rodrigo, thank you. It's good to see that there's a world out there. Yeah, so if you don't mind sharing your camera, it's always good to see some reactions. And it's a pleasure to see those of you joining us. Grace and Derek and Kristen and Rodrigo and Chitra and Min and Lee and everyone else out there. Hi, Cass. Thanks for joining. So this is a session on code and a little bit about using code in the visual arts. It is very much oriented to those of you that maybe have never used code or maybe never used this particular framework of code, which is a very accessible framework, really popular among artists and designers. And so I want to just kind of talk about how to use it and why you might use it in the course of this session. But we're going to get our hands dirty and actually do some coding. And there's kind of a lot to pack into an hour and a half. I don't feel like the programs we're going to write are all that complicated, but to explain them so that you understand what's going on and kind of where to go from here, it does take a little while. And I do want to end with some cool stuff, like where we're actually making some cool stuff. So I've broken this into sort of two parts. Part one's going to be fairly simple, where we're going to learn to draw with code. We're going to be using a framework called P5.js, and I'll talk more about that, but it's a JavaScript framework based on a software language called processing, and processing's been around since 2001. Processing was invented in the MIT Design Media Lab by Ben Fry and Casey Reese, who are both like professors elsewhere or in the field, or at least Casey is professor at UCLA, and I think Ben's just working now. I don't know if he's teaching anymore, but anyway, they invented this in part because it was so difficult to really get visual arts made using code. Like the barrier to artists was really pretty high. And so much of what you do in a computer science class ends up with output to like a console log or something like this, where you don't get to see anything. As artists, like we want to make marks and that's what we do, right? We're mark makers. We want to see our work. We want to have it manifest and get to see it. And so sometimes the abstraction of code prevented that ability to see things quickly. So they created what they really called a sort of a software that made sketches, right? Where you can, and sketches, it's like, hey, it's not so formal. We don't have to worry about all this complex stuff. Let's get visuals quickly. Later, like about 15 years later, if not more, I'm not exactly sure when it launched, but they were talking about, hey, if we wrote that one, processing was based on the Java framework. And a lot of people were thinking, if we rewrote processing today, what language would we use? And everyone thought, hey, JavaScript, let's make it for the web. Let's incorporate web elements into it. And so now there's a new framework. It's called P5.js. And it is a framework based on processing, very similar. If you're learning P5, you're learning processing at the same time. It's more or less the same code base, except now it's available for the web altogether. And it leverages JavaScript. You can mix and match JavaScript with it. So if you know anything about web coding and JavaScript, you can also gain access to like anything on a web page using the framework and like make it more creative and dynamic and move it around and do all kinds of fun stuff with it, right? So it's a really, really powerful framework. So I'm going to share my screen and kind of get started with the presentation, but we're going to start by drawing with some code, and we're going to end by making a poster that uses typography and image together. And through this whole process, the focus really will be on the elements of design, because we're designers, we kind of know about the elements. So I want to talk about point, line, plane, shape, color, texture, image, and these elements that we use to create things and how we could do that pretty simply with code. And using this framework, you'll find it's not so scary. At least initially, I think you'll find it's not so scary, but you'll also see the power of learning a little bit code to get deeper and deeper, because ultimately we can make software with this software, right? We can make the programs that could drive our art. We could make full-on video games with this software. We could make art installations with it. when you can make your own tools, the boundaries are somewhat limitless for what you could do. You're not beholden to Adobe this whole time for making tools if you want to, right? You can write your own code, write your own tools in that case. And that becomes really powerful for doing some things that might be a limit otherwise. So inside of the chat, I'm posting a link. Some of you might have already gone there. This is just a resource link. It's on my website, and it's just going to be where the code notes will be. And some of the, if I share a link, then it will be typically on there for you so that you can find it from there. There's also just some, if you get stuck and your code doesn't work, you can find some sample final code that you could copy and paste back in to make your code work. So we'll get this rolling. All right. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see it, and hopefully you guys are starting to see this little thing moving around. Is everyone kind of seeing that?
Yes.
Cool. All right. So this is a little poster that I did with dynamic code. You'll see that in the end, what I'm hoping that we can make is something that involves some type and image. And, potentially that's interactive, right? So this moves around based on the mouse position. If I snap out, it goes away, but it's just a little sort of dynamic poster that I made with code. And in theory, I could generate like thousands of posters very quickly, all a little bit different, all using the same code base. But you can see that it embraces this idea of randomness and chance and chaos within the design process. And so, I think that becomes really important to our own, to creative code, to generative design. You're going to embrace some level of randomness and chance. And I will say that everything in nature makes itself that way, right? From the snowflake to the snowstorm, there's some level of order and disorder. So some level of pattern, but also some level of variety, randomness, and chance that create things. And so by thinking about both of those things and how we might use the computer to have levels of order, for example, repeating elements for a rhythm or for a grid, or disorder, such like randomness and playing around, and how we can empower the user as well to become some level of co-author in their experience. By being a user, I can decide where I want to put the main branding, right? And I could experiment with what looks best to me really, really quickly in an interactive system, right? So there's some real power, I think, to embracing code. And so I went ahead and put that up at the top, but all the workshop files are down below. Before we really get started, I just wanted to say hello and say who I am and who some of my colleagues are that are joining us in this session. So my name is Carl Cleveland. I teach in the Media Arts and Technologies Department at MiraCosta College in North County, San Diego. I think we've been a little bit of a well-kept secret in San Diego for a while, in that we're up north in San Diego, but we've got a full-on design program, a lot of online classes as well as on-ground classes, and programs in graphic design, web development design, video and media design. This is where I'm coming from. And so I teach a class here called Programming for Animation, Interactivity, and Games. A student made that Matt logo, by the way. Students made this website. I'll give credit to those students that made the website as well. And yeah, it's a big part of student involvement here, a big part of our program. And so anyway, we do a number of different types of things. You can learn a little bit about me and my colleagues right here, but I'm joined by Lee Kotner and Min Choi. If you guys want to say hello to the group too. I know you've already been doing that, but.
Hi, I'm Lee Kotner, and that's all I'll say just for the sake of time. Nice to meet you all.
Hello, my name is Min Choi, and so nice to have all of you. And we're so happy to share this awesome knowledge. And I have to say, I'm the one who's afraid of and scared of coding. And I find you guys will have the same joy that I had when we did a practice run. So welcome.
They were lucky enough or unlucky enough to be my guinea pigs in this. So we did a little run through and realized it went way too long. And so we're going to keep it a little shorter for you guys as we go through this. But yeah, let us know. They'll help me out if you guys have questions along the way. You'll notice that inside of the workshop here, we've got some links as well to other resources. And the primary one that we're going to be working with today is this framework called P5JS. I'm just going to launch that since we're looking at it. This is an open source library. So it's made by the community, embraced by the visual arts community. And really, it's a JavaScript library for creative coding. So with a focus on making code accessible and inclusive for artists, designers, educators, beginners, and really anyone else. I'm not as familiar with the D3JS library. There is a ton of libraries out there. I will say that I've used some of them, but not all of them. Certainly the Create.js library that's from sort of Adobe and Adobe Animate, like the former Flash stuff, is one of them that can do this type of work as well. There's particular game libraries like Phaser.js for making games. So there's lots of libraries out there, and this one is really specific for artists and designers and really beginners. And it embraces the metaphor of the sketch, right? We are mark makers, we draw. We're gonna draw on a canvas today, except the canvas is gonna be in our browser. And in order to do that, we've gotta get started. And so from P5JS, you have some editors that are available online. So we've got this editor, and you can link to that editor right here from the P5JS website or from my links. But if you want to follow along, and I highly encourage you to actually follow along with this, then go to the editor. I'm already signed up, so my editor is like color coded for the colors I want, like it's customized, and you'll see it says hello Carl Cleveland here. But if I was to do that same editor in like a private window, it would look like this, and I would have no ability to save my work. So I can actually edit and try stuff out. Like if I play this, it's actually gonna make like a little canvas right there. So you can follow along without saving your stuff. But if you ever wanna, so feel free to do that. If you're like, yeah, I'll come back to this later, you can still follow along. But if you wanna ever save anything, so it automatically gives you a name here. And if I wanted to come on here and save my file, I have no ability really to do that without logging in. Okay, so it says save here, but it won't save it to anywhere because I gotta be logged in. So I encourage you to sign up. It will allow you to come back here and save your files, and it'll allow you to upload some stuff and come back and use this again. It's totally up to you. These are the only fields you need, and you're signed in. So sign up though if you ever want to come back and want to save your stuff. I am signed in, and once you're signed in, it will give you access to this editor, and then you can then look at, like I've got a ton of sketches that I've saved out via the editor. So you can see I've got a bunch of stuff in here already kind of saved, saved out at different times. So like I've got over time, I've made a bunch of things using P5JS. I will say that maybe I'll show just a couple of those as well. I've got a few different ones that are out there because we're going to ultimately be making some posters. Thought maybe I'd share some posters that I've made that are dynamic. I was really inspired by the AIGA Get Out the Vote poster campaign. And so I was like, how about I make a dynamic poster that every time you click it, the poster's different. And so like I was playing around with this idea of animating some type and like having these voter posters that come together. And you'll notice that as I click, it's sort of the system changes. And I will say that one other thing about generative design is that sometimes it's not good out of the box, right? Like you'll make something, you go like, oh, I wouldn't design it that way. Like, I don't like the way that this interacts. What I do like about it is that you can iterate really quickly. That design is so much about play, and honestly, code is about play. Like, what if I change this parameter? What if I try this? And you can play quickly. That's what I like, is to play quickly with code, to look at different things. And every once in a while, you get something that's maybe more interesting or what you might not have thought of if you were just designing in a regular environment. Not only that, I can make it interactive, I can make it move, I can make it dynamic, I can involve the user. And so that becomes kind of a fun thing. Just to show you maybe some other ones, I've made some other, like I was playing around with different, code posters, and this one just sort of follows the mouse around and, vote as if your life depended on it kind of thing. These are all sketches that I'm able to save out. Let's see, maybe this one right here, image and text. I can't remember what all of them do. This one just sort of moves around in some crazy ways. Maybe this one, like, and this was like, it was meant to be for a big screen. So it's kind of at a 1920 by 1080 resolution here, but that's being scaled down. But this type of like repetitive thing where the font size changes, I could make this, you know, in Photoshop or Illustrator, but trying to change the font size for literally every word and how many words do I have, like, it's pretty time consuming. Whereas I could code this thing out, you know, and maybe 50 lines of code and actually make that work and then make it interactive. Like, so I have it change, right, from red to blue potentially, or in personally more favorable to me would be from, yeah, red to blue, but instead of blue to, but there you go. That's that. And so we can play around with these things. Yeah, you can absolutely save your files out. I'll talk about how you can do those. You can get them out as PNGs, you know, but there's possibilities for how you can export your graphics out. And in fact, in the sample code for the poster, I pre-built in a function. All you have to do is hit S on your keyboard and it will save out a PNG of your poster. So I'll show you how that works. It's super easy to make that happen, but you can absolutely get your files out. All right, so these were just a couple samples just to kind of give you the idea of where we're moving in terms of building stuff. I want to do this sort of dynamic poster thing, but you got to start by having an editor of some kind. So please get to the editor and then we can get going. When you go to your editor, you should see something a little bit like this. There's some stuff that starts this out. So if you're able to be on Zoom and also in an editor, please do that. Get to an editor and we'll get going with some of the rest of that. I will say that, and I'll come back to this, there's a lot of reference examples and other things that are available. And one of the ones that I'll mention while you're getting to the editor is there's a great set of tutorials by Dan Schiffman of NYU on programming with P5.js. It's just a phenomenal resource at the Coding Train. And he's got a big playlist of free videos about programming for P5.js. We've got now like an hour and like 10 minutes together or something, right? So we don't got a ton of time, but if you wanted to go back through and just learn these basics like about code, it's very accessible. It's easy. This playlist is free, open source to you, and like great for beginners in terms of learning a little bit about code. So I wanted to leave you that resource from, you know, a mentor of mine in that sense is Dan Schiffman out there creating a ton of videos, and he's got this Coding Train website which has a ton more than I just shared with you, but these are all specific to P5 basics.
Carl, there's a quick question. Somebody had a question in chat. Can we export these files out as video, or the captures out as video or GIF files?
Right. So I addressed that briefly. You can save them out very simply as PNG files, which I'm going to, once we get into the poster, once you hit S, you'll be able to do that on your keyboard, and I'll show how to do that. There's other export mechanisms out there for grabbing your stuff as well. So yes, we'll be able to export that out. I'm not going to demonstrate anything other than how to export out to PNG today, which is really simple. You can just save your canvas out. And in fact, any canvas, because we're working on the HTML5 canvas, once I have a canvas, and like if I hit play, it generates, I don't have anything on it yet, but I could save that canvas by simply right-clicking and saving that frame at any given moment as well, right? And so to do a video, we're going to have to save multiple frames in order to do that. But there's ways to get that out as video, and you could make yourself GIF files as well. And there might be some plugins to do some of this. There's a big community. I've not tried to make a plugin, a GIF file right out of P5, but so I'm not sure if that's readily available as a way of saving out, but it's very easy to get your images out, and I'll show how that's done. All right, so I want to come back to this web editor, and hopefully you're on a web editor too that you can play along with me. There's a couple starter things that you'll always see inside of P5 in the editor. There's a fully online cloud-based editor here. It's actually a really good code editor. I will say this is all JavaScript. So behind the scenes, there is an HTML5 page that houses our references to the P5 library. If you wanted, you can download the library and not be cloud-based. You can just work locally. That works as well if you're familiar with that. But basically, we have references out to a CDN that downloads the P5.js library. and then puts in your JavaScript file into that. We could style things using CSS as well. And so we could add additional elements to the page, but this is all just on a web page, by the way. And so there's these sketch files, they're kind of hidden behind the scenes. What you really should be on is the JavaScript version called Sketch.js. That's where we're going to be writing all our code. But behind the scenes, we could upload additional files. I'll be talking about how to do that. But like we can upload like images and fonts and sounds into P5.js as well. And those are behind the scenes here in our sketch. But I'm going to keep that closed. And let's focus on what we've got going right here. So by default, when you create a brand new file in P5.js, there's two functions that automatically are run. They are called the setup and draw functions. These are pre-populated for you because you're always going to have a setup and draw. So they give you a couple things. You can change some of the parameters of this, but the setup is going to be the thing that runs first and runs once. So this basically runs first and runs once. So we can set up a bunch of the environment that way, right? And then the draw function, it's going to run over and over again, runs, and I'll just say what these are, runs over and over again. What am I putting in here? I'm putting actually code comments. So a comment in your code is led by two preceding slashes. If you wanted a quick key for adding a comment, the control/ on your keyboard, by the way, will allow me to comment and uncomment very quickly within the editor. But basically you get a setup and then you get a draw, and the draw runs over and over again. So it's going to actually draw, and this really runs at the refresh rate of your screen, which is roughly 60 frames per second by default. So the draw function basically redraws the entire screen 60 times per second, or maybe as fast as it's able, depending on the processing power of your computer. Okay, so that runs over and over. Those two things are preset for us. The other thing that this does is it creates a canvas for where we're going to draw. That uses the canvas tag in HTML5, if you're familiar with it, which is a dynamic sort of drawing surface. It's like a JPEG that you can change moment to moment, if you will. Like you can redraw to it. And we can draw text, graphics, shapes, anything, colors, whatever, to that canvas, and then change it a moment later. And so it becomes like where like your game will live, or where your artwork will live at any given moment, right? That's where the output takes place. And the size of that canvas by default here is 400 by 400. If I hit play, we get to see our code run, and it's going to run in the frame on the right. And right now it's just making a canvas of 400 by 400 in size. If you wanted to, you could try changing that size. Like I could go 600 by 400, rerunning your code, and you'll see that that is going to reset to a different size. And I can make any canvas size that I want. That is the width and height that will be there. And we'll talk about the colors, but by default, it's drawing a background color, which is kind of a light gray right here, not quite white. If I put 255 there, it'll actually draw it in white. But sometimes it's nice to work in a slightly off white and not have so much contrast. We'll talk about how color is added in just a minute. So in this workshop, and you guys can pause me at different times if you have some questions along the way. The one thing that I know that this looks a little confusing to people right away is that it says function and it's got these parentheses and curly braces and all of that. What I'm going to say to you is embrace the chaos of learning something a little new that's maybe a little confusing. All of those things are meaningful and they're helpful. It's just a different way of writing language, right? And so we can start to translate how we write English to how we write code. And I will say that there's a couple common things here. One is these things are called functions or methods. These two methods are run immediately once you don't have to call them, they're immediately run when you launch the P5 software. So we've got this setup method, and anything that is a sort of function, it really runs in a code block. Like everything I want to do on setup is going to go in between an opening and closing curly brace. Everything I want to do on draw is going to go in between a opening and closing curly brace, right? So all the code that we want in those cases are going to go in between them. And when you see a function, functions do something. They're the verbs. They're like the verbs in English. Functions and methods inside of programming are the verbs. That means they do something. And all of the verbs in JavaScript have parentheses after them. If they're a function, they have these parentheses after them. That's how you know it does something, as opposed to maybe attributes of something called a property, or an object name or variable name. The way you know it's a method that does something is it's going to have these parentheses after it. And sometimes you pass information to that method to tell it kind of how to do it, right? So I know I want to create a canvas. Well, what size do I want that? So it takes two arguments or parameters in this case, and those are the width and height. Okay, so just so that we kind of have a little clarity. Now, the things that I want to do, excuse me, I got something stuck in my teeth. There we go. The things that I want to do, to drive me crazy. I had to eat lunch like really quickly today. So is I want to code the elements of design. And so those are going to include the things. I'm going to make a comment here, so coding the elements of design, if you want to write a comment in, but we're going to look at like coding things like point, line, shape, and color in this first sketch. And then in the next one, we're going to code, then we're going to go into part 2 where we're going to code image, and we're going to code type and typography as well. And if we had a lot more time, I'd talk about arranging the space, but all of this is going to be in space in some way. But these are some of the elements of design that as designers you're going to be familiar with, and I want to help you translate those things to code. So before we get into coding right here, there is a pretty common framework for making graphics. You might be familiar with Photoshop, and I'm showing Photoshop quickly because one of the things about Photoshop is we don't really think about it, but if I come on here, for example, with a rectangle tool and I make a shape, I make a rectangle, I just went and drew on the screen, but behind the scenes inside of Photoshop, it's remembering some really important information about our shape. And if we're coding, those are the pieces of information we also need to know, right? And so I can open up the properties for my particular shape, and I can see that it has a width and height to it, right? And I also, right here is our width and height, and it also has a coordinate of where did I put it. If I wanted it in the top left corner, I would actually move it to a 0, 0 pixel position. This is pretty familiar with many of you, right? And we could resize this. If I wanted a perfect square, I might, put this in at 200 by 200 to, and I'd have to unlock it, I guess, in order to make sure that that's a perfect square. But I'll put this in at 200 by 200, and we could get a perfect square. I want that perfect square to be 100 pixels from the edge. I could put those elements in and do exactly what I need, right? So this idea of drawing is really familiar with inside of Photoshop, and we don't have to see those numbers in order to do it in Photoshop. But in code, that's the thing. Those are the things we need to know. We need to know like coordinates and sizes and things, because those are really the codes behind the scenes inside of Photoshop that they're also using, right, in order to place this in the right spot. So it gets really easy to code inside of P5.js. We're going to start making our first elements here. But in doing this, I thought what we could do is code out, and I wanted to talk just a little bit about how we might code. First and foremost, you'll notice that we've got this kind of Cartesian grid system if we're working on canvas, and the very top left corner is our 0, 0 point. And then as we go to the right, we're adding to the x-axis, right? And as we're going down, we're going to be adding to the y-axis. And so I've got these grids sort of out there to give you that example. Some grid systems go into the negative where you go back, and up, and the points start in the middle. Well, keep in mind in Photoshop and in P5.js and in Canvas, we start with the 0, 0 point in the top left corner, and then we move positively to the right or positively down with our code. So the thing that we're going to code out is what I'm calling the code bot right here. It won't take us long, but we're going to learn how to make this shape, these simple shapes with code, and draw that out very simple in JavaScript. And then we're going to start looking a little bit about how might we make this bot randomized? How might we make 1,000 versions of that bot? How might we, involve the user into changing the bot every time they do something? And so that's where the code comes in, because why would I make this in code if I can just draw it in Photoshop? Well, if I wanted to have like a lot of variations, or I wanted to involve the user, or I wanted some level of randomness and chance. I wanted the software to generate some of the elements there and let me see options, right? Those are all things I can do with code. If I wanted to visualize data, maybe, you know, I can talk about how many robots there are in the world and how many more robots there are, and I want to put little robot heads on graphs, but that's like dynamic data being pulled that's always changing. I could visualize that stuff with code by drawing with code. And so that's what code brings to the table, is that ability to visualize data, or to add chaos and randomness, to mix elements together, or maybe to involve the user in some way, right? And let them make choices. So all of that's pretty powerful. It also allows me to animate things. It's not static anymore, so I can move things around the screen. So we can turn it into a game. All of that can be fun. So I've got these sort of coordinates of where these central points are as well, so that we can reference those things when we're drawing our own bot. And so what I'm going to do is come back to my code then and see my web editor, and let's start actually coding these elements. Let's get into code. All right, finally. Are you guys with me? Kind of. I can't see very many faces, so after you share your screen, I barely can see anybody. So thank you to those of you responding. Let's get rolling. So the first thing I want to do is actually draw some stuff to this. And so let's start actually with the very simplest code element, which is coding a point, right? And so if we're coding a point, we really just didn't need to know where to put the point. We just need the XY coordinates. And what you're going to find is that all of this works really, really similarly. So I've got a point in the code bot. These circles right here could be considered points. They're sort of big points at this point, right? But I know exactly where those are. So I've got circles for the eyes there, and they're kind of just a filled in point. They're at 140 by 180 for that very first one. So in order to code that inside of P5.js, we're going to use the P5 library. And all I need to do that is simply type the word point. So I'm going to say point. And the way that this is set up, by the way, is that we've got point, and then we've got an XY coordinate of where that point should go. And I'm going to put in some comments here. So if points look like this, all we really need to know is where to put the point, right? It's a single point, so we just need the XY coordinate of where that goes. This is what's called a method or function inside of P5.js. Technically, functions are things that we make and custom design, and methods are sort of innate to objects within the system. So there's a little difference, but basically methods are forms of functions. So I don't even worry about that terminology. At this point, all of these sort of functions, just like point, right? That means they have parentheses after them. That means they're going to do something. So how do I make a circle? I type circle and put parentheses after it. How to make a rectangle? I type rect and put parentheses after it, right? So we're going to be able to make these shapes. They're designed in very similar ways. You're going to get familiar with that. After the parentheses, we're just going to put a semicolon, and that means that we're done with that line. It's just an end of statement. And it's like a period to a sentence. It means you're done with that line. And so all that means is, hey, I'm done with that line of code. So in this particular case, there's two parameters to make that really is required to make a point. Those are the XY coordinates of the point. And so that's what it looks like, but I need to put numbers actually in there. So I'm going to put in the numbers from my code bot. 140 at 180 is the actual numbers that I want. So let me put that back into the system, 140 by 180. And what I could do then is end with a semicolon, and you're not going to even see this yet. But I've made a point. Whether or not you can see it, it's so tiny that you can't probably see it, but there's a point there. All right. So points are a little tough in that they start by default, they have a 1 pixel stroke value to them. And so a point is literally a 1 by 1 pixel square. It's very difficult to see. All of our shapes can be modified through color in some different way. And the first thing that I'd like you to do so that we can see our points is to add something called the stroke weight. And we add it in a similar way, But rather than like putting it in, selecting a checkbox in Photoshop, we just need to type in what it is. In this particular case, the command is called stroke weight. And what we want to do is add in a value to that. And so I'm going to make my stroke rate 20 pixels rather than 1 pixel, which is the default stroke weight. And now when we do this and I make a point, we can actually see it. There it is. We can actually see what we're getting inside of our design, right? So if we give it a little more stroke weight and we add a point, very, very simple to do that. So you can change these numbers around, but before I do, I want to go ahead and see the other code.i. It's at 260 by 180, right? So remembering those numbers, I know I need an XY coordinate. And once we establish something, I'll talk about this in a minute, but once we establish something, it cascades down. So once I have a stroke weight, we've established that, and all the subsequent code will be affected by that stroke weight. So in this case, I can put 260 by 180 in there. I'm going to have this auto refresh. And we'll talk about the camel case piece of this. Yeah, thanks for the chat on there. Right, I'm going to say auto refresh now so that this automatically updates for me. If you check that box as you type, it kind of automatically will update once you've done a new line. And so now I'm getting both of my points in there, right? Both I points are right there. You'll notice there is some strategy for coding. Because our codes won't work with spaces, this now is going to break and give me a syntax error down here, right? So spaces are really important inside of coding environments. And so when you have two words in JavaScript, they use what's called camel case to do that. And so instead of having a space, the subsequent word will be capitalized. So anytime you have like two words in a method, you'll find that the second word is going to be capitalized. It starts lowercase and then gets capital. All the methods kind of do that, just like create canvas up here. See how there's a capital C? That's really because there's two words to that method to describe what it does. Well, you have to have the right case. And if I put a lowercase there, it is not going to work again. It doesn't understand anything that has the wrong syntax. Unfortunately, computers are really dumb. They're like idiot savants. They can remember anything you tell them. They can do math lightning fast. They can make calculations super fast, right? So they can remember anything, do crazy math. But if you don't articulate your idea perfectly with perfect syntax, it doesn't understand the thing you said. So you've got to really be very precise with your code. And in this case, we're going to have a stroke weight, and we're going to add a couple points to this. You now can see, hopefully, that I'm getting the points of my my bot here. Mine's a little smaller because I've expanded this out just so we can see it, right? But in scale, so my points look just a little bit smaller, but nevertheless, we're starting to get the points of that. And the one thing I wanted to mention about this, these points that we're making, I'm going to do something here real quick. I'm going to copy them both and just comment out the first set of, I'm going to comment out the first set by hitting Control/. You don't have to do this necessarily if you don't want. I just want to depart for a second because these points could be dynamic. These are actually being redrawn to the screen. We're in the draw function. So they're actually being redrawn to the screen 60 times per second. And so if I wanted to, I could make these points sort of based on other things. Like what I could do is make the point sort of based on the mouse X position. And now I've got one point that's following the mouse on the X position, right? Or if I wanted it to be a custom cursor, I could type in the mouse Y position. And these are simply sort of proper, they get out the current position of the mouse. And I've got kind of like a custom cursor moving around for one of those points. Very, very quickly, those things can change, right? That's kind of cool. What if my stroke weight was based on like mouse Y? All of a sudden now my points not only are following the mouse, but as I move up and down, they're changing dynamically based on the position of my mouse. And we're getting something that's interactive. And we've only written like 2 lines of code, and all of a sudden we're getting like this interactive interface, right? So it doesn't take long before this gets good. I'll say that like, okay, what am I doing? I'm just drawing a bot. Well, it doesn't take long for this to get really, really interesting. So thank you. I think it's fun too. So in this case, like we can get dynamic really, really quickly. The other thing I want to mention is that these things that I'm putting in, those could become variables altogether. And so, for example, like I'm just going to do this. Let me bring this back to just being a 20-point stroke weight, right? One of them's interacted this way. If maybe for the other one, I actually defined X and Y as some sort of like with some sort of variables. So you don't have to worry too much about this if you don't want to do this with me, but I can make variables. I'm going to go to the very top of my code and define some variables and say sort of what those are. And so let's say I started the variables saying that the X and Y were at the different point coordinates that I wanted. I'm going to say, I'm going to have a variable. I'll call it X. I'm going to say let X equals 260 and let Y equals 180, right? Those were the numbers that I was originally starting with. So instead of the actual hard-coded numbers, I could put in the variables that I created. And sure enough, that point over there, maybe I'll turn this other one off for a second. That point over there is now at the XY variables. The power of putting these in variables is that we could change the variables. So what I could do is say that the X is going to equal the X value, but plus something. Like, let's say I say plus 5. What this is quickly going to do is move off the screen and animate because we keep changing the value of X. We're going to make X equal to its current value plus 5 over and over and over again, 60 times a second. It's going to quickly move off the screen. Maybe I make that move slower, right? And in that case, we can make the X go slower off the screen, but we're getting animation right away. And we could do the same thing with the Y coordinate. Maybe I say that another way to do this is to do these these are called operators, by the way. So I could write X equal, like I could write the exact same thing with plus equals 1, which means it's X equals X plus 1. You'll get familiar with these as you get into programming a little bit more. I don't want to get into the details of the operators, but minus minus means that it's just going to subtract 1. And so there it goes in a, like, not only, you know, on the X, but also on the Y coordinate upward. And if I only did it on the Y and not on the X, right, and we redo this, then it's going to go straight up. So we can make things animate. We can make them interactive very, very quickly. Honestly, I'm going to comment out all this other code that I've been doing and just keep my points for right now, because I just want to draw the code bot. But I didn't want to like wait to get to some good stuff in terms of being able to be interactive or animated very, very quickly in P5.js, right? So we can start putting in variables in there. We can make things based on the user, their mouse position, or if they're clicking. All of those things can be a part of what we integrate. All right. You guys hanging in? What are you typing in order to comment out? I'm typing 2 leading slashes to do that. And by the way, there's a quick key for that. It's the control key on your keyboard slash. So if you hit control slash, it's a quick key for doing that. On Mac, it's command slash. Okay, so if I'm right now I'm using a PC, but you can translate on Mac. If I say control, I mean command. But it's just a quick way of commenting things in and out. And so in this case, all of these lines of code are as if they're deleted. They're not operating. I might leave them in there as references to what we did at some point, right? But great question. All right, so we're good making points. Let's get on to some of the other, we were talking about the elements of design, and I want to move kind of into some fun stuff. So let's talk about coding a line. We know our code bot, and by the way, you can also find your code bot right here. We can figure out where the coordinates of that line are, right? To make a line, I need to know where the line starts and where the line stops, basically. And so in this particular case, I've already got the coordinates written out here in Photoshop. 140 by 260 is where it starts, and 260 by 260 is where it stops to make this particular line on the coordinate system. And we can see that, right? There's our line at 120, 140. These are all, each line is 20 pixels. So we're kind of seeing where those are, and by 260 on that plane. All right, so in order to make a line, I'm going to come back to my P5.js sketch right here. And the next thing I want to actually make is a line. I'm just going to put in a comment that that's what I'm going to make next. And to make a line, the basic code looks like this. You're going to need 2 parameters. You need x1, y1, and x2, y2. So as I'm typing this out, this is what the basic code looks like, because these are the parameters required to make a line. You need to know the XY coordinate of where it begins, and you need to know the XY coordinate of where it ends. And so to draw that out with our coordinates, I think I had it at 140 by 260 as the beginning and 260 by 260 as the ending coordinates. And as soon as I do that, I'll be drawing my line. There's the line. Right, you might need to stop and hit play to do this if you didn't check auto refresh. And I'm getting, okay. Sorry, I was looking at the chat, but I think Lee answered, right? So I think I'm good.
Carry on.
Okay, thanks. One thing that you'll see in this particular case is that the stroke weight right here carried on to the stroke of the line. And all code in JavaScript is read top down, right? So you get this execution order. There's some complex stuff that's called hoisting that we won't even talk about, but where some code that's below will come up. But anyway, generally code is read top down, and that means your code at the top will start identifying things. So if we needed to change things, it's inheriting the stroke weight. It's now stroke weight is just being set. So if we need to change that, we would do that in front of drawing the line the next time around. So I'm going to add stroke weight again right here, and we could change that to, like, for example, 5 pixels instead. And then that line is going to be a little closer to my original CodeBot drawing. It's going to be just 5 pixels instead as far as that stroke weight. We'll quickly get into color, because certainly I can change these from the default color is black. So that's why we're getting black, but I can change those colors as well, change the stroke colors, and we'll get into changing the color in just 1 second too. Okay, so fun with this. Let's just move on to a couple other things inside of that. What are the 4 coordinates for a line? Does it consider the line as a rectangle? Not exactly as a rectangle. Great question. The line is what is the point? Really, a line is in between 2 points. So you have to have point 1 and point 2. So x1, y1 is point 1. Where do you start? x2, y2 is point 2. And so if we change, for example, this y value right here, and we redo that, that line is going to be moving up between those 2 points, right? So it doesn't consider it a rectangle. And part of the big difference between points and lines is there's no fill. Once we have a rectangle, we'll also get a fill color. Just like vector graphics, you have a fill and a stroke that we can apply here. And so we'll get a fill color once we start making shapes that can have a fill on them. So that's coming next. I'm going to keep my line from my code bot right there. And I want to take a look at my bot, and we'll get the next part of this. So one of the next things I want to do for my code here is let's draw the rectangle around the outside of this. So I see that rectangle starts right here in the top left corner of it is at 60 by 100. By default, it's going to draw lines and points and rectangles from that top corner. So when we get into circles, it actually draws those from the center, and you can change and where things are drawn from if you want them from the center or from the corner. But by default, rectangles are drawn from the top left corner. So our starting coordinate for our rectangle is at 60 by 100. Let's go ahead and draw that rectangle. I'm going to come back to my code right here, and we'll talk about making shapes. The first shape that I want to draw is a rectangular shape. So I'm going to make a rectangle. To make a rectangle, the code for that is called rect. And we need to put in parameters into our system for the XY coordinate of where that rect begins, as well as a width and height of where that is, how wide it's going to be and how tall it's going to be, right? So the height of it. So we can quickly do that simply by typing in rect and putting in our numbers, which I already forgot. Let's see, they are 60 by 100. I have very poor short-term memory. 60 by 100. And then we also need to know the width of that. And so those things go, if I go back to my thing, I see that they go to 340 on this other side. So that's about 280 pixels across then in terms of the width. And it goes from 100 to 300 down. So that's 200 pixels tall in terms of the height. So knowing that, I can translate that to my code. I'll put in 280 as the width, and I think I had 200 as the height. And there we go. We're starting to get our rectangle now showing up. And you'll notice something about the rectangle. It's covering up the lines and circles that we had before. By default, a rectangle is now a filled shape by default, and it fills it with white, which is the default color. So there's a couple ways that I could handle this. I could draw the rectangle first and have it fill with white, and then draw my points and lines because it's red top down. Or what I could do is temporarily, at least, I could take off the fill. You can add a line of code called no fill in order to do that. And we could take off that fill. Everything I'm showing you is available at P5JS. And I find the references there really, really good. So I just want to show you that reference. And there's a whole thing about making different shapes and drawing, and it's under they're all categorized, right? So you'll notice that we can make things like lines and points and rectangles and circles and ellipses and squares. I didn't even show you how to make other lines with Bezier curves, but you can absolutely do that by adding weighting points to this. And if you want to learn about how to make them, you can always just simply click on that particular element, and it talks about how do we make that. Well, with a Bezier, you're not only making a line, but you're also making the weighting in between the lines. And we could think more about that. But it will show you sort of the sample codes of how we make that. And in this particular case, the first two are a control. The first ones and the last ones are control points, and the middle ones are weighting points. And it talks about those as being the way that we might do a Bezier curve, right? So if you wanted to make other shapes that I'm not showing, get into P5JS, take a look at the references. They're very good. Everything we've just been doing. For example, I just made a rectangle. We could take a look at that rectangle. It tells you how to make it, right? If you wanted to round off the corners of that rectangle, we could actually add another parameter that would just round off the corners. So there's other ways that we could draw these rectangles. And the rec mode is where it's being drawn from. So some of these will link out and it says, oh, rec mode by default is in the corner. And so it's being drawn from that corner. So this reference is really, really good. And it's going to share information about how to work with color, how to work with all these things with great examples. There's great reference material that makes it easier to learn P5JS when you can't remember the syntax of something. I want to come back to this. I had mentioned that if I added no fill, that will get rid of that fill. So now I can see my code bot right behind the scenes and sort of what's happening with the bot. So pretty fun with that. I want to add the circles that are a part of the eyes. Let's try that out real quick. And then we're going to kind of depart and go to part 2. But inside of my design, I've got a couple circles. They're right here at the 140 by 180 point and the 260 by 180 point. When we're making a circle, all we really need to know, if it's a perfect circle, all we need to know is the beginning point, the very center of that circle, and the diameter or size of the circle. And so in this particular case, the size of the circle is roughly 40 pixels across, right? So we're going from the center, we're going 40 pixels. That's our diameter, or really that's the radius, right, of our circle. So that's how big I want this to be. I'm going to come back. And we can draw, for example, a circle shape that way. I'm going to go ahead and type in circle here. The circle requires, when we make it, it requires an X, Y, and it requires the size or diameter of that particular circle. I want to make my circle here at the 140 by 180 point, really the same center point as my point. So it's 140 by 180, but I wanted to give it a size of 40. And there we can see sort of that rounding one, or maybe 80, a little bigger size. So I can play around with what those sizes want to be simply by changing these numbers. If you want yours to look a little different, put in different numbers in there. looks like 60 is a better diameter for what I'm wanting right here. And we could then put, both circles on. I can type circle again and make another one. In this case, the X coordinate is going to be at 260. The Y is going to be at 180. And I'll make another circle right here at 60. And our CodeBot is starting to look like Philip again. By the way, that's a sort of anyway. I named my CodeBot Philip. You can name your own bot, but I don't know. Philip is a little bit sad today. He's a little he's not sure about being created on the spot like that. All this variability of what he's going to look like, but yeah. A circle is like a point, but with volume. And by the way, if we didn't have fills as no fill, our circles would be filled with color as well. And so we would fill with a color if we wanted to do that. We can always come back and re-add our fill and decide what color we want. And we'll get into that in just one second as well. One of the things that's fun with coding, by the way, is the ability to maybe randomize some stuff. So let's say this value right here for 60, where I'm actually making that, I'm gonna take this out on the second one. And one of the things that we're gonna start doing is embracing the idea of having some randomization and stuff. And so rather than hard coding in 60 as the value, I'm gonna put a random number that will be between 1 and 60. And in that case, you'll see that in this particular one, let me move it to the other side so that, right, in this particular case, that circle is going to be changing all the time. We're going to get some animation, and it's randomizing from a small size up to the largest size in case of 60. Or what I might want to do is put in 2 parameters into my random function. Like if I type random and then parentheses and give it 2 values inside, separated by a comma. Oops, I just moved that. Right, in that case, it's going to be randomizing between 30 and 60. Really super easy to get random numbers and random values in there. And this is running at a frame rate. It's going really, really fast. In this particular case, it's sort of running at a frame rate of 60 frames per second. If you ever want to change that, you can go back up to your setup right here. And there's a command called frame rate. And I could like drop this down to something maybe like I could really see. So if I change it to 5 frames per second, you'll see that those are animating, but a lot slower. Right, so maybe that allows us to see that. These are global properties, so if I change the frame rate anywhere, I'm having changes that's redrawing it slower, but I can quickly change my frame rate around to a different frame. By default, it's at 60 and it's going to go really fast, right? But we could see that at some lower frame rate if we wanted to, and we could always change the frame rate again, later. But now we're kind of seeing that sort of idea of having a more dynamic something. And sometimes what I like to do is not necessarily run this over and over again, but to like run it, and then get something and pause it right there. If I ever wanted to pause something or not have it loop, you could actually add a command called no loop, and it wouldn't redraw it but more than one time. So with no loop, it's going to randomize that size, but not go back and redraw this again. So by default, we're doing something called looping, but as soon as you say no loop, we're only going to get it once. So every time I hit play, I'll get a different value for that other eye, and it's always going to be a different size, right? But it's only now doing it one time, and it's randomizing it to different sizes. Sometimes it's hard to tell that it's even that different, but we should be getting just slightly different sizes each time. Be more dramatic if I put this to 180 or something, and then our sizes should be a little bit more dramatic, right? Where we can kind of see this and try different sizes out for our CodeBot. So those are some of the fun things we can do with this. I'm going to bring that loop back on. And in that case, that's going to be animating around. If I don't want that animation, I could always turn that off and just bring my other, comment that line out, bring this other one back. But by the way, I could also make this a drawing tool. Maybe I want the size of the circle to be based on the mouse Y. And so as I move my Y parameter up and down, you'll see that the size of that eye can change, right? So it can be based on user behavior too. I'm making it based on my mouse Y position in this case. Woohoo! All right. Fun with code. There's our CodeBot. We can, if you wanted to make the square, you can make the square. I've got a little square at the top. I'm not even going to go there because we're running low on time. One thing I really want to talk about though is I want to talk about color. So you can code color in all kinds of different ways, but I don't need to keep my strokes at that default color. I can change their color. So I'm setting the stroke weight, but I never actually set the stroke color. So we can set that up. Let's talk just a little bit about color. And you'll either apply color to the stroke itself, and we can apply some sort of color to the stroke, or we're going to apply color to the fill. So the fill itself, and we'll apply it to the fill. Where you apply it is in between the parentheses of those things. So you can assign a stroke. You can also say no stroke if you didn't want a stroke, or a fill, or no fill if you don't want a fill. And then we could give it a color. And in any way that you can imagine giving it a color probably will work, because you can put in CSS values, you can put names in there. So for example, as we do our stroke, I could say, hey, I'd like all of my strokes to be in purple. And I could just literally type in purple. If it's a piece of text, you got to put that text in quotes. I'm putting it in single quotes. And so if we redo this now and we take a look, you'll see that all of our strokes are now in purple. Right, it's inheriting that for all of the different strokes that are there. And so that's pretty cool. I can do that in purple. If I change this up and I said, no, you know what, I want a stroke and I want to use a hexadecimal value and I want that stroke to be red. Well, what I could do is put in the hexadecimal value for red, and we could add that in here, and you can add that hexadecimal value in. For these, you've got to put them in quotes because they're kind of a piece of text there. Did I do this? No, I got an extra quote mark. There we go. Right. So if you're familiar with web coding and hexadecimal value, you could put that in. Now it's in red. We could do things like RGBA, right? So with a stroke, you can actually pass in values. So if you're familiar with RGB and we wanted red, let's say I wanted blue, I could put in RGB values from 0 to 255, 8-bit color, right? And I could put in 3 values there. This is going to be the red, green, and then the blue value. And we could code it that way, and we're getting it right in different ways. So you can code color in lots of different ways. If you're familiar with CSS and you're like, oh, I want to put in RGBA value, you could do that. You just got to put it in quotes, RGBA, and then we could put in all kinds of values here. Maybe I want quite a bit of red, quite a bit, of orange, and maybe not quite so much blue. And then I wanted to have a partial transparency. I'm going to say 0.5. So if you're familiar with coding in other platforms, you could add that to your P5 sketches as well. So this is with a little transparency on it. You can see that a little bit on the overlap, right? We can code the code blot out with different transparencies, different colors that are available. So pretty cool to do that. All right, sort of fun with that stuff. The other thing we could do is do this with fills. So the same kind of thing we could also apply to a fill. I know I'm moving fast, but instead of saying no fill, maybe I'll go ahead and say fill, but I'm going to fill with whatever color I want. Like I'm going to say fill with red. And in this particular case, we can fill that in. And oops, what am I getting? I'm getting a problem. I'm missing, oh, I've got a semicolon before the end. There we go. So I can fill that in with red. So there we go. I'm getting a stroke. We can't see it that well, but you can see that I'm getting a fill and a stroke on my my shape in this case. If I wanted to drop that stuff in the background behind all of this, what I could have done is taken that and brought it up here where I took the element. I could cut it from here and put it behind my lines, like up here. And then it will be read a little bit differently where those other things are going to be more on top of it so that we see the other colors. And we could change what sort of fills and strokes we're getting. Maybe when I come to these circles, I want to do a new fill there, but at a different color. And I go, oh, those I actually want to fill with white. And I'm going to use the hexadecimal value for white, F, 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 F. And we could just bring that in. And now I'm filling those with white, right? We're not seeing the points anymore, but you can see that we could add color to fills and strokes. We can take the fills and strokes away. One of the things that is really fun with this is to randomize color palettes. They actually have a color palette. and randomize that. So I'm going to show you that in our part 2. We got to move to part 2 because we got like 20 minutes left. So in this particular case, I'm going to come back to my thing. Hopefully you're sort of coding your bot and you're following along with me a little bit. This isn't as interactive as I typically like in a classroom, to be honest. I'm sort of rushing through. I can't really see people, but hopefully you're getting a little sense of how this is working. I want to see if I can see a few more folks and get a thumbs up or like some references if you guys are kind of following along with me and still there, still out there. So that's great. If you wanted to, to play with this, you could always, if something went wrong, I want to say your sample code, you can copy and paste that. So here's the sample code for the code bot. You could try that out, just drop all this code in, or if you messed up a code somewhere, maybe you can kind of see where it is and be able to sample that over. The next thing I want to do though, is we're going to move on to creating a little poster, and we're going to add some image and type to that poster. So I've already added a few pieces of code to make this go a little faster, but we've done point, we've done lines, we've done shapes, we've done color in terms of the elements of design. Let's talk about type and image, because I know that many of you would be like, yeah, I want to work with type and image. So we're going to do that. I've got a starter file to do that so that you have everything you need to begin with. I'm going to open that up, that starter file. It looks like this. I want to share that starter file with you, and you can share any of your P5 sketches by going File and then hitting Share. And you can like share an iframe embed of your sketch, different things. You can share an editable version of it. So I'm going to copy that to my clipboard and paste that into chat. Lee beat me to it by like a fraction of a second because she's always a little faster than me, mentally and physically. So like there's the starter file. If you want to click on that one from chat, if you signed up, you'll be able to save this and reference that starter file, into your own sketches. And because P5JS is such an open community of things, if you want to come back and take a look at other sketches I've done and how I've done them, that you could actually just go to my sketches and look. Oops, not there. Where do you do it? My sketch library is actually available. Like if I open this in a new tab, so carlkleeman.com/sketches has a bunch of stuff that if you want to look at some of my experiments, you'd be able to do that. Once you're kind of on P5JS, most people have these open things, and there's a bunch of sample files that are out there in the editor as well. I'll mention that the editor itself has these like sample sketch files. So if you go into like help, you can go right to the reference, and there's a bunch of examples right here, file examples. And if I go over to those examples, I didn't save this one, so I don't know, maybe I don't want to go from that one, but there's a bunch of examples of different ways of doing different types of things with code. It will really bring you over to the examples of our P5JS, and you can find those files, and you can simulate, check different stuff out, like check out this flocking behavior that somebody put in about how you can move your mouse and add new birds and how those birds will start animating, and you can imagine your own complex animations there, and how that's built is all right here, right? So you can see that code, kind of figure out how it's done. It can get maybe a little more complex, as you see, but this is not that crazy. It just looks a little crazy for a brand new, when you're brand new, your eyes are on it for the first time, but it's really pretty accessible as you get to learn the system. All right, so I want to talk about making a dynamic poster. And so I've already added some stuff, this ability to have fonts, ability to have images. And so I'm doing something called preloading those things already for you so that you didn't have to type all this out. But when you're working with fonts and images, you want them to be available to your program. You need them to load first, right? So there's something called preload, which is a function that P5 allows you to do. And that allows you to load everything before it tries to render it to the screen, right? And if you didn't do that, it would take a while to render potentially, or you'd have maybe some code errors because it doesn't find what you're talking about. But by preloading, we're going to be able to work with images and fonts a lot more quickly. The other thing I'll say is that you can also load fonts up from Google Fonts. So in my index here, you'll notice that I'm preloading. I've got a link out to Google, and I'm loading this font called Abril Fatface, which I think is a cool font. And And so I can also load like dynamic web fonts and use those in my sketches in order to use fonts. So you can either add fonts by uploading a file and dropping those files. And you notice I've added TrueType or open source type fonts. So any open type fonts, the TTF or OTF formats work. I can also add images here. And the way that you do that is you look at that little behind the scenes sketch files. There's a drop menu there, and you could say upload a file. And I've already uploaded files for you. If you go to that sample sketch, you should be able to see these files. But I can upload images, SVG files, JPEGs, PNGs, stuff like that. I could upload fonts, TTF or OTF fonts into that. And then I'd be able, I'm going to go back to my sketch file. I'd be able to preload those images and fonts and be able to work with those. So I've given them some names too. Like, for example, font 1 is, Alpha Slab, and font 2 is Brush Grip, and font 3 is April Fat Face. So these are variable names that I'm just calling those fonts to make it a little easier when I load them in. So now I can reference them. And honestly, font 1, font 2, font 3 is kind of bad font names. Maybe I mean, they're just in sequence here. But we've got a couple of different things here. I also got a SVG of the San Diego Design Week logo. Let's talk about bringing those onto our canvas. So right now I don't have anything on the canvas. I do have some sample files down below here, some custom functions. And I'll talk about what those do. Those include the ability to loop or not loop based on if you're pressing your mouse. I'll talk about that, as well as saving your files out. As soon as we get some cool stuff, I'll show those to you. All right, so one of the first things that I want to do here is I'd like to actually get some type on my screen, right? So I want to be able to add some type. So to do that, let's go ahead and draw some type. We can do that in our draw function. And we're going to add some type to the screen. So I'm going to work with type now. In this particular case, to add my type is really easy. You just use this thing called the text command. And there's 3 parameters that it takes. It takes what text you want. That goes in a string, right? And then it takes an XY coordinate of where to put that text. Those are the 3 required parameters for your particular type. So all we need is really 3 things, except our type isn't going to look great right away. But let's go ahead and put those things in. I'm going to start. And you can start with whatever you want, but I'm going to actually, just put in my name to begin with. I don't know why I commented that out, but I'm going to put in my name, and I could put that at some sort of coordinate system. And so what I might do is just put it at 100 by 100, right? So that's the XY coordinate. If I hit play, we should see some type show up on the canvas in that case. It's not the font I want. It's not the color I want. It's not the size I want. We're going to make this more fun in just a minute. Right, but we can do those things. We can put all those things in. Maybe I'd like my type to be right in the center and a little bit larger. We can start to add some different, properties of this to make our type a little bit better. So in this particular case, what I'm going to do is add some properties. One of them is for the size, and I'm going to make the text size quite a bit larger. Let's say I wanted the text size to be about 200 pixels. And that's going to make that a lot bigger. It's going off screen in this case. What I'm going to ultimately do with my text is use really what my favorite special character is, and that's the ampersand. I love ampersands, I'll have to say. The ampersand it's inclusive. It means with. It means we're not alone. Something else is coming. You got this, but you also got this. So now you have design and you also have code in your framework, right? So I love ampersands. They add to something. They're value added. It's us together. It's a we. It's not an I. And so they also are beautiful. I don't know if you know the history of ampersands. They're based on Latin for the Latin symbols for and, which are the E and T. And so ET was and in Latin, and then so what they made is a ligature of E and T, and then from there that ligature became, some ampersands still look like an ET, but a lot of them don't look anything like an ET anymore, but that's how that started. All right, anyway, let's say what I wanted was this to be in the very center as well. I've got it at 100, 100. What I could do is divide the width of my canvas by 2 and the height of my canvas by 2. as far as the location of where that's going to go. And what that will do is it will put that right in the center. And the reason it doesn't look perfectly centered right now is that it's still doing it from the baseline of this, and we're not saying to center our text. So I'm also going to put in a text align command right here of center center. And that means for the vertical and horizontal center, we really want that in the middle. And then it's going to drop our code, basically the width of our canvas by 50%, right? Divided by 2, the height of our canvas divided by 2 for the XY coordinate. And we're going to align that to this dead center and add that piece of type right there. All right, fun. Now let's do a couple other things with this. I want a font in there. So for that, I can come on here and I could say text font, and I could put in whatever font that I want, but that font does need to be installed on the end user's computer, right? So I could type in this case, Abril Fatface, which is a really beautiful font for ampersands, I think. And in that case, the reason that's loading is because I've got that as a web font. So back in my index, I mentioned that I loaded that up via Google Fonts. And I agree. I think that font is beautiful and it's a great font. Sometimes you don't want to rely on the web, or you have no web connection, because you might use this software to create like a interactive kiosk or something that's disconnected from the web, like an interactive interface that's standalone. And in that case, what you'll want to do is load your fonts. And so you got to upload your file. And just like I did right here, I gave the name, I loaded the Abril Fatface font. I called it font 3. So the other way I could do that is through that variable. So instead of doing it that way, I could say text font, and I want font 3 in there. Right, and so we could put that in as well, where we add in this other font. And I can put in any of my font styles, and hopefully these will refresh and show you the different fonts that I'm loading in. And there are some different styles to these. We got a few of them. So this is the only one that still looks like an ET. You know, by the way, like that one, you can see the how that was a ligature of ET, which was Latin for and. Anyway, Abril Fatface, I think, was font 3. There it is inside of our system. We'll play with this even more in just a second. Okay, so that's what we really need. Like, there's different parameters for fonts. I can load them. I can load in my font. I can align it. I can give it a size. There's more that we can do with fonts. We can also stroke fonts. The color here is based on the fill color, right? So what I'd like to do is actually explore this really quick, that we might start adding a little randomization to our fonts. And so one of the things that I like to do is, and I'm going to come on here and do this. I'm going to create a variable called colors. If you want to do the same thing, you can do this. And just say let colors. So one of the things that you often will start your sketch with is like variables for the things you want to remember. For the things you want to remember, right? And so I'm going to remember a variable called colors. I don't even assign it a value yet. I just know that I want that available in my memory. And what we're going to do is we're going to make colors a variable that can be sort of different colors. I'm going to do that right here in the setup. And I'm going to say colors is going to equal. And I know this is a little weird, but I could give it a value here, right? So I could make colors equal a particular color. So what I might do is use some of the colors from San Diego Design Week. So one of the colors in San Diego Design Week is a hexadecimal of F9 F15A. And they use a kind of yellow color. You can see what that is. Once I type that in, there's a way to change it right there, right? But I'm going to start by putting that color in. I'm going to make that a colors equal to a variable. And by colors, you know it's going to be more than one, right? Right now I got one. We're going to make that more than one. I'm going to come back to this. And I know we're getting low on time. I don't know. I'm getting text messages now. I don't know what they're saying, but we're coming back, and we want to assign this as a color. So before I actually write my type, I'm going to write fill. And I'm going to pass in the colors that I actually wanted right there. I'm going to say fill colors, and you notice that it's going to change that color to the color that I'm getting here for this. Now, I don't love my background color either, so we can change all that stuff up in a minute, but this is part of that first part of this, right? So we're going to get the color in. What's cool about this is that we can create our own color palette. So to make a color palette, we're going to turn our colors into a list of colors. And I know I'm going kind of quick for many of you, but hopefully you're sort of getting a sense of this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put brackets around my colors, and I'm going to turn the variable into an array. And an array is just a list of things, okay? And so we can pull from the array later, but I'm going to turn my variable into an array. And what I'm going to do inside the array is put in some other colors. So I'm going to put in the color white, let's say, as well. That's one of the San Diego Design Week colors. I'm going to put in the color for the sort of pinkish red that they use in San Diego Design Week, which is this E94568. And I'm going to go ahead and put in one for this for the dark the dark color that's in here that almost looks like the word bicycle, but it's 1B, 1C, 1L, 1E. Okay, so what I've done is I've made an array of different colors. And why is that not, well, it looks different than I was anticipating in terms of the color.
You have double quotes and single quotes.
Oh.
Does it matter?
Yeah, no, it does matter. If I'm mixing and matching here, we're gonna get this wrong. So let's go ahead and make that a single quote, and then but that's not what was wrong. It was, I might just have the wrong color. In this particular case, I think I might have just had the wrong color. 1B, 1C, 1E, right? 1B, 1C, 1E. That should not be green. That should be whatever. We could go 1B, 1C, 1E. There we go. Yeah, it just was a temporary weirdness. All right, so this is our colors. One of the things that's kind of fun for me is to start randomizing within a system. So let's say I wanted to randomize my color palette. I could do that by coming down here where we say colors, and I've got an array now, and I can pull random colors out of that array by just wrapping random and then having colors be the thing that fills in here. So now this is actually randomizing what color I'm getting for that particular font as you see that go. The way that a random value is, you just type the word random, and then you pass in some sort of parameter into the middle of it. So it looks like this. But if what we pass in is another array, it will pull one random value out of that array, out of that list. And so I can get random colors in there. I might want to do things like randomize my size. So instead of 200 here, I'm going to say that I wanted a random size between 100 and like 400. And then what we're going to do is randomize the size of my font quite dramatically in this case, right? I could put that in. The truth is, I could also come up to my fonts and put those in a list. I could say fonts equal and put an array of font 1, font 2, font 3, and font 4. And in this particular case, all of those things we could randomize within, when we're assigning a font, I could say, hey, let's go random from the fonts as well. And now we're changing all of these things. Now, when I click on this, by the way, if you're using the same system, it's going to stop on one sort of random version of this, which is kind of fun, right? I can end up clicking on one random version, stopping on that, and using that to sort of get my font. We are, and I don't know what's happening. I'm getting like a bunch of text messages from my, okay, that's not just my,
I like the chat comments. Whoa, that's awesome. Cool.
Okay, so this is the advantage, is that what we might start doing is designing systems that have some level of randomness and chance on them. And I've already added, like, because we're running out of time, I'm glad to see that your screen is fun and other people's are fun. I already added some random stuff here as well that's going to add stuff. So I created this thing called random fill type. It's a function, and random stroke type. So I just want to show you what these functions do so that we can move a little faster. You get the idea of what I'm doing here with type, right? We're randomizing from some colors. We're randomizing from some fonts. I've got one other thing that I need to define, and that's blend modes. I'm going to come up here and define those as well. So I wanted something called blends, and you can have blend modes inside of, so I'm going to define a variable called blends up top, and then right here, I'm going to add blends, and I'm going to put in an array of different blend modes. Those blend modes are, I'm going to make them blend, which is normal, multiply, and if you're familiar with blend modes in Photoshop, multiply and burn and overlay do basically the same thing. Now I've got some random blend modes I can also apply. And the reason I'm doing this is what I want to ultimately do is apply these functions. And what this will do is that it's a slightly different function, is that I can pass in what character I want to work with. So I'm going to randomly fill some type, but I'm going to pass in the text that I want, and it's going to put that text in to my function. And then it's going to randomly blend it, randomly fill it with my chosen colors, randomly give me a font, and randomly give me this varying text size, all with a single line of code. And this is what the power of making your own custom function does, is I can make my own custom function and then add it. So I'm going to take this thing called random fill type, and instead of everything I'm doing up here, literally, I'm just going to comment this out. That was an example. Instead, I'm going to use, but inside of my draw function, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my command that I had already defined to do this, called random fill type. Now, inside of this, you've got to give it the type that you actually want to put in. So I can put in my and character right there. And now if I rerun this, it's going to call that function, but also add these blend modes to it. So if I stop at any given moment, these might overlap and blend in some different ways where I could kind of see them go, and it's adding those on, right? What's interesting about that is I could actually call this multiple times. I could say random fill type twice and double up the amount of like symbols that I have on my screen at any one moment. So we can kind of see how these different blends are working. I know they're getting a little crazy right now, but we can kind of see what's happening. The other thing I might do is use this random stroke type, and instead of fills, I'll use the command called random stroke type and put in, I'm going to stroke an ampersand as well. Now you could put in your own initials here or do something else, but I could stroke that as well. And in that case, when I stop, I might get a random stroke, I might get a random fill, I might get some random blends. And it's a little bit radical, but here's what's fun about this is that sometimes it's absolutely terrible. I'll click on it and be like, no, that's just never what I would design. But every once in a while, I get something that I like, that surprises me, that's kind of cool in some interesting way, the way that it's moving, the way that it looks. And that's some of the power of this, is that ability to do generative design, right? And I keep crafting the systems of my code to make it better and better and better. The way that we add images allow us to do blends as well. I will say that we're kind of out of time. So the last part that I might do is literally just take all of my final code samples so that you could play with this. And I'll just kind of explore this. I'm going to take all of that final code sample, copy and paste it, and put it into my dynamic poster. So I'm going to select all, just paste in that code sample. And it has kind of the completed version of this that adds some image to this and also adds kind of what I'm talking about, right? Where right now I'm putting in an eye as the different ones that are coming in. Oh, I've got this thing called Do It. Oh, so I have my own function called do it in this case. Sorry, I forgot that this was in there. But do it basically will allow me to pass in any parameter. And what it's doing here is it's calling that and then coming down to this one and adding a random field type, random stroke, then 2 more random field types and 1 more random stroke type to it. So once I say do it, it's passing in it's kind of calling all those other functions, and all I really need to do is put that in one time. Now, did I said do hit type stop my refresh. I broke it. Oh, I put that in the wrong spot. Sorry. That's got to be in the that's got to be up here in the draw mode. So right there is where I had do it. All right, anyway, all you would have to do is type in what letter you want right there. So if you paste in your own code, you can kind of get a play with this, right? Where it will kind of make your own poster here. So you put in whatever you want, like you could say, do it with K, and that's my initial. And I could play like with the letter K and see what happens with that and what kind of things. You can put in whatever inspirational letter. I could put in both K and then say do it again with my other initial C, and then see how those mix together and get myself maybe a new logo with my and ligature with my, it's getting a little radical by having more than one in there. But this becomes sort of better and better as we build on it. The grainy backgrounds are random images. By the way, I'm going to ask what's happening. It's loading in these images, and I took all of those images from subtlepatterns.com. They're like corkboard and concrete and gravel. And then I'm adding a tint on each of those. We didn't quite get there because we're just pretty much out of time, right? But I'm adding a tint to that random image. So it's randomizing what image that is, and then sort of adds a tint on there based on this. But if you want to try this out, you can copy and paste my final code from here into your own system, change this to your favorite character, right? And I'm sort of like, the idea being we're getting sort of randomized type, and there's some code here that when you press your mouse, it will make it loop or not loop. I talked about, whether we could stop the redrawing, and so it's looping or not looping every time I stop, and I could try and stop on something cool that I actually like, make myself a little San Diego Design Week poster in that way, right? And if I hit S, by the way, there's a little thing that the command is simply called save canvas. I have it set to when we hit the S key. So as soon as I'm done like with something that I like, and I go, oh, that one's kind of cool, whatever, and I'll find one that I kind of like, I can hit S and I'd save that one out as a poster. I did create like a little inspiration poster using this system by putting in different, running it and running in a different letter each time. And so like, this is kind of what came back out of it, was this sort of inspiration poster where I ran it and saved out different versions with different letters, right? So we can kind of come back through there and run this out. And really, I've got this, I've got that where it runs it one at a time. And I know that we're totally out of time. We ran over. I'm going to hang out if there's questions afterwards. I'll let you guys go. But, hopefully you're getting a kind of sense of what the power of code can do, some of the creativity that's involved with code. I'll show you one other sketch, though, in the editor here. I'm going to just go to my sketches. And like, I've got some other versions of this as well. Maybe it was, I don't know, this one. That kind of do these in different ways. So like the same kind of concept, right? Where it's making a San Diego Design Week poster using the letters inspiration, kind of randomizing them out, blending them together. Like you could take this where the whole thing is generated in one code rather than doing one letter at a time. Like I'm doing all the different letters in these kind of blocks and randomizing them to different blocks, putting these into different places. So it's a similar kind of thing to what we're doing, loading in some fonts and drawing those back to the screen with some blend modes on them or whatever, but it's looping through these in order to create a kind of grid-like structure for those. So there's some other examples that are out there. I'll let you make your own. I know that we didn't get as fast or as far as I was hoping. I always think we're going to be able to get more done more quickly, but and I don't see getting some direct messages, which I can't see. But okay. Let me kind of pause this here. Yes.
I just dropped your the link to the course that you teach in this kind of stuff in the chat if anybody's interested in taking that class. It's your MAT 190 class.
Cool. The
Yeah.
other thing I might do is duplicate this particular code, this dynamic poster, and I'll call it, dynamic poster done, and I can share the editor to that. So I'm going to say share. I'm going to copy that editor, paste it in here. And if you didn't get yours to work, what you could do is click on that editor and it should launch this. And the only character for this one, it's a system where all you would have to change is what character you want to render out. And you can try this out and play with these numbers. Like maybe you don't like your font so big. Well, I could simply change the values here. Oh, I'm going to make that where they're not going to get quite so large by making my random size a little smaller, and they're never going to be quite so large. Although the strokes can still be large in this case, but not the other ones. Maybe I want to change what colors I want, right? So you can go back to the color palette that I had there, put in your own 4 or 5 colors or whatever you want, and then go through that. So try this out. The fun is in experimenting with all the parameters and seeing what comes out. Thank you for everyone that stuck around for overtime. We went about 15 minutes, if not more, over. There's still several of you here, glutton for punishment. I hope if you've never coded before that this helps put you on your way to experiencing a little bit about code, checking it out. We went so fast that, we got to go a little slower. It would be even easier if it got a little confusing. But it's not that intimidating. Once you get into it, you realize, hey, I can figure out what this does. It's kind of like making marks. I just need the code for making marks rather than a pen tool, right? And then let me just make a circle. What color is that circle? What stroke is it? I'm going to randomize it. I'm going to put it in a new location. I'm going to make it based on where the user is. I'm going to let the user click on it. All of a sudden, it opens up the world of possibility to what you can do on the web anyway. That sort of interactive screen-based design. But we can also push this out for print. If I had to design 1,000 posters for San Diego Design Week, I guarantee you I'd do generative posters, because I'm not going to make 1,000 things, but I can make 1,000 things really quickly with code. So I'm glad to hear that, Miko. Thank you. I'm gonna end my recording and stop my share, and we'll go into overtime and take some questions and hang out with you guys. But it's been a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed Creative Coding for Designers as part of San Diego Design Week. Let me stop my recording.